I can tell life from TV, Jeff. TV makes sense. It has structure, logic, rules, and likable leading men. In life, we have this. We have you.
The protagonist of a TV show has a considerable amount of weight upon their shoulders. They might need to be the most interesting, or the funniest, scariest, most intelligent, most evil. But in the end, it boils down to one question. Are they worthy? Do they deserve to have the most screen time? Does the show function without them? Does the actor deserve to be paid the most? This pressure can lead to criticism and scrutiny, and rightly so. At the end of the day, what is a show without a worthy protagonist? The protagonist I want to focus on in this instance is Jeff Winger. In Season 2 of Community, Abed questions Jeff's worth as the leading man. He implies that Jeff is not likeable. In that precise moment, Jeff was certainly not likeable, but with all things considered, Jeff was likeable throughout the show. He wasn't likeable in a wholesome and obvious way like Troy or Abed. His likability is a little more complex. Despite the show having an ensemble cast, it's undeniably true that Jeff is the protagonist of Community. The first episode's plot is centered around him, and he claims the most screen time of anyone in the show. He is most often involved in each episode's A-plot. But the question I am posing is not whether Jeff is the protagonist. I want to discuss his right to the throne. The protagonist of a show must have a backstory. Off-screen events that have been brewing over time. This backstory must then combust into what we see as the very beginning of the show. And this is what triggers the actual story. In movies, we call this the inciting incident. It usually occurs around a third of the way through, after Act 1 and the initial setup. Sitcoms do not have this luxury. A 20-minute episode must get down to business immediately. Jeff has this complex and intriguing backstory. He is no Walter White, but he is as complex and as layered as a sitcom character ever needs to be. He faked his bachelor's degree and now must reluctantly attend Greendale Community College to get his career back on track. This reluctance is what triggers Jeff's character development. On top of this initial backstory, Jeff grew up without a father. His lack of father figure is integral to providing an insight into why he is the way he is. On the surface, he appears to be well-adjusted and in control of his life. Underneath, the opposite is the case. He is not well-adjusted. He is often shallow and arrogant. This unravels in the Thanksgiving episode in Season 4 upon reuniting with his dad. His dad sees what we thought we saw in Season 1. After getting to know him better, we see him as much more complex. This level of complexity is essential for a protagonist. In this sense, Jeff is worthy. I want to directly discuss the issue Abed brings up in the beginning of this video. Jeff's likability. Despite TV shows like Succession, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, or even Breaking Bad having protagonists in an ambiguous state of likability, I would argue that a sitcom like Community needs to have a likable protagonist. Wholesomeness is a theme that runs throughout the show. Therefore, a character leading the show in the same vein as Kendall Roy, Dennis Reynolds, or Walter White simply would not work.
Separate entirely.
Yes, Mac.
That's right. I-S.
Separate entirely. D-E-N-N-I-S. The dentist system. That, my friends, is the key to winning any girl's heart.
Only a likable character can pull off speech after speech about how we all need to be nicer to each other. So, despite Jeff's arrogance and shallow nature, I think he remains a likable character. A character trait that is linked heavily to likability is sympathy. From the very first episode, Jeff is somebody who loses. He's desperate to sleep with Britta. He manipulates Professor Duncan into giving him answers to exams. He attempts to get rid of Abed and the rest of the group. All these endeavours end in failure, at least in the first episode. We even sympathise with Jeff in the final episode. All the people he reluctantly became friends with became his family, and now they are all moving on to objectively bigger and better things, while he remains at the school he so desperately wanted to leave from the moment he arrived. So, while Abed doesn't truly believe that Jeff is not likable, I think it's fascinating to see a character raise the topic of another character's worth as the protagonist. One of the key aspects of Jeff's arc is his desire to become a better person. This desire brews up inside of him in Season 1, without him realizing. He learns lessons throughout his first year at Greendale, but it's perhaps not until the final episode of the season that he begins to appreciate the value of them. In Season 2, he uses his manipulative tendencies for good by using his leverage on Alan, while remaining loyal to his Greendale family. In this season, he is still lazy, and he is uninterested in most activities and classes. And, to be honest, this never really changes. Because of this, his growth into becoming better feels plausible and believable. In such a surreal and wacky world, it's ironically Jeff's development that remains realistic. The catalyst for Jeff's growth was abundantly related to the friendships he made at Greendale. From the very first episode, he was the leader of the group. The group listened to him and respected him, but most importantly, he understood all of them. He was always the first to cut Abed off before one of his TV references could spiral out of control. Not just because it annoyed him, but because he understood him. Jeff connected with Abed because they were both raised by TV. Jeff's friendship with Annie was perhaps even more significant. He began the show as a man who didn't believe in marriage or having a family, and finished as a man who wanted all that and more, all because of Annie. Jeff was integral to the group because he understood a group of misfits that were so desperate to be understood. And this not only makes him a worthy leader, but a worthy protagonist. Despite losing Troy, Pierce, and Shirley in seasons 5 and 6, Jeff intriguingly becomes less of a protagonist as the show becomes even more ensemble than it originally started out to be. Existing characters like the Dean, Annie, and Abed receive more screen time and development, and we are introduced to some characters who really do a decent job at getting the show over the line of the 6-season prophecy. But I think the reason for Jeff becoming less of a protagonist is easily explained. The majority of his development had been completed already. By this point, he was more content and secure. A big mistake TV shows make in their declining years is beating the dead horse with already completed character development. Jeff's development wasn't fully complete, but the writers needed to save it for the finale. This allowed other characters like the Dean to shine. One could argue that all these other characters thriving in the spotlight damages Jeff's worth as a protagonist, but I see the opposite. The fact that a show can have their protagonist take a step back and still function as a character shows that their status as the protagonist wasn't the only thing they had going for them. Finally, I want to discuss a character who, in Season 1, was arguably second in line to the protagonist's throne. A character whose development famously disappeared entirely. Britta. In my opinion, Britta lost all development after Season 1. Her character was unnecessarily dumbed down. Most stories she was given involved her thinking she was a qualified therapist. The demise of Britta's intelligence makes no sense until you think about why the writers chose to do it. In Season 1, Britta existed as Jeff's love interest. However, the show subverted the typical sitcom love story trope by having them be largely incompatible. Once Britta was no longer Jeff's love interest, the writers couldn't find a place for her in the story. So they fell into the crutch that many comedy writers fall into. They lowered her intelligence for comedic value. Did the writers sacrifice an entire character just because they wanted to take the arc of their protagonist in a different direction? Maybe. Was Britta a more worthy protagonist than Jeff? Also maybe. I would counter this by saying that this is more a fault of the quality of writing in general, rather than claiming it was Jeff's fault. Jeff was the protagonist, but it was far from a development dictatorship. There was room for Britta to have more development. The writers just needed to handle her transition from Jeff's love interest into her own person more thoughtfully and carefully. Annie and Troy showed that development, irrespective of Jeff, was absolutely possible. And so, Jeff's status as the protagonist was not what harmed Britta. It was the writers. So, was Jeff the worthy protagonist? The structure of most episodes was often heavily reliant on one of Jeff's classic speeches. In the beginning, it was new and fresh. His speeches carried a weight that felt authentic and justified. By season 2 and 3, they perhaps became overused. But it ended up becoming a staple of Jeff's character. I honestly don't think any other character could have pulled off something like this. The speeches, while admittedly cheesy, corny, and overused, provided some much needed cohesion to each episode. So, in this sense, I say that Jeff is worthy. Finally, I think there is one aspect of Jeff that, for me, confirms his worth as the protagonist. And that is how they wrapped up his character. I can't imagine any other Community character having a more poignant and meaningful ending than Jeff.
You're gonna be fine, you know.
I don't want to be fine. I want to be 25 and heading out into the world.
I personally took a lot of comfort from Jeff's ending. Not because this year I will be 25 and heading out into the world, but because Jeff gave me perspective on my own life. His journey taught me that we are all constantly growing, long before we even realize it, and even longer before we start seeing the benefits of it. Jeff is a worthy protagonist because he is us. Manipulative, insecure, selfish, distrusting, lonely. But ultimately, and hopefully, someone who wants to fix all those things.